And welcome to Writers on Writing. What? Yes, I am your host, Dr. Brenda Green, and we are coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the airways of WNYE 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you each week and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers talk about their lives, their craft, and their work. And Desiree Cooper is our guest this evening. Desiree Cooper is a 2015 Kresge Artist Fellow, a former attorney, a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist, and a Detroit community activist. I love it. You've combined all of those components. Her fiction and poetry have appeared in Callaloo, Detroit Noir, Best African American Fiction 2010, and Tidal Basin Review, among other online and print publications. She was a founding board member of Cave Canem, which is a national residency for emerging black poets, and she is a Kimbioli Fellow, which is a national residency for African American fiction writers. So you have really such a wide range of writing, writing background experiences.
Yeah, some would describe it as schizophrenic, but I like that description better.
Yeah, I think about how people who are writers and educators and journalists and mothers and wives. It's what we do as women is we work to create that unified whole, and that sometimes is a challenge.
Yeah, and I also think, I've only ever wanted to be a writer, like since I was 4. I had a stint where I wanted to be an astronaut, and other than that, that's all I've ever wanted to do is write. And I think lots of times, particularly in communities of color, no matter what the social economic condition of the family, there's a lot of pressure to, like, what is your real job going to be? Like, that's not going to do it. You've got to have something that's going to give you some financial stability. And so I think that explains my work background, like that constant search to figure out how to turn writing into a real job, quote unquote, and never quite doing the writing I wanted to do until now. I'm
Yes.
57 years old, and it's finally, I have a chance to do that.
Okay, and I'm glad you started with that because I was going to ask you what motivated you as to become a writer, and you also had a job. You worked as an attorney. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How you made that transition from being an attorney to being a writer?
Well, the journey wasn't quite that easy or quite that short. It's really been a lifetime journey. So I was a journalism major undergrad at the University of Maryland. And when I was about to graduate, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to live independently the way I wanted to as a scrub reporter. And so I said I need a graduate degree, and I just decided to go to law school. So again, all of this is about just trying to, striving to walk through the doors that the civil rights activists of my parents' generations opened. So as one of the first generations out in integration, it's like, come on, we fought all the fights. You guys have got to, sort of walk through and take those opportunities. And so I was keenly feeling that kind of pressure. And so I ended up in law school, ended up practicing law, and, from there I left the practice of law after about 5 years and did nonprofit work and then got into journalism 12 years after I got my journalism degree. My first job in journalism was in an alternative paper. And all that time, Brenda, excuse me, I was writing my stories and sitting with writing groups constantly and writing poetry and growing and sort of getting into that community, going to readings. I never lost that dream. I just felt like it was a hobby. It wasn't real, quote unquote. Um, so it really took me a very long time to start sending things out and saying, I almost had like an AA moment where I said, I'm Desiree Cooper, I'm a writer.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. At what time when you said I'm really a writer? And you
Yeah, I
own
mean,
it. You
I was,
own it.
I was really in my 40s, and I was doing work with community organizations around working in diverse environments, and part of that was some explorations into who are you and where are you and how do you define yourself. And I was actually leading those sessions, and as a part of that, I just came to my own realization that I'm sitting there playing around my real talents and my real life goals, what my soul really wanted. And it was in one of those settings that I said, I'm a writer. I'm just going to claim that, and that's what I'm going to start working toward. And not a journalist. I didn't consider that my writing. Not legal briefs, but creative writing or essay writing that really dealt with the human condition. So I was in my 40s before I even came to grips with the fact that, yeah, that's what I am. I'm going to claim that now. I'm going to work toward it.
Right. So you have a new book, Know the Mother, Stories by Desiree Cooper, a very, very moving book. Um, Marianne, Williamson from the New York Times best-selling author wrote, "Every once in a while you read a book and it blows you away. Know the Mother was that for me." And then your blurb talks about, I think it really zeroes in on how it affected me, is a heart-wrenching meditation on the archetype of the mother in all of her incarnations. The stories emanate from many directions, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
There are some times when I just sat, as I was reading the book, I had to just sit down and think and just meditate, because you had a way of really getting into the interior lives of women.
Mm-hmm.
What motivated you to write these kinds of stories?
Well, I think being a woman was my greatest motivator, and having gone through, you know, girl to adolescence to woman to single woman to married woman to mother, and now I'm actually caregiving my parents and taking care of my grandchildren. So, all of these things are different stages of many women's lives. And what we see out there constantly are messages about how we should feel about those phases of our lives, how to be happy about them, how to reduce stress around them. And there's such little validation about the real conflicts and hardships and struggles that nearly every woman that goes through these phases have at one point in their lives. And so people have often said to me, like, is there a happy story in there? And I'm like, well, some are more lighthearted than others, but they all have sort of a gut punch for a lot of readers, because I'm not trying to do Hallmark. I'm trying to validate experiences, real life. I always say, like, this is how gender is experienced in intimate settings. It's the living of the isms and how our society is structured. So I'm not doing political rhetoric. I'm just moving you through the lives. Like, here's a pair of shoes, put them on, and let's walk through this life and see what that feels like. And so that's what I was trying to do with the stories.
And I think that's what drew me in, and what draws me into this type of fiction is the fiction that's really very authentic. As you said, it's not Hallmark. And I'm wondering how much your background as a journalist and as an attorney who deals with real life issues um, influenced you or had an impact on your need to tell the story and to tell these stories in this way. So in other words, I think that sometimes novelists, they they have the imaginative mind frame of the kind of stories they want to tell. They think about, well, I'd like to discuss this. But you take real life situations and use story to bring them to life.
Hmm. And a lot of people think that they're all my story because they have that feeling of this really happened. And I tell people that they didn't happen to me, but they're all true. They're all true in the sense of these are situations that repeat themselves in various iterations every day. I do think that my training, in particular as a journalist, really influenced the form. The form is called flash fiction,
Yes.
and so that's short stories that are short, like 1,000 words or less, about 4 pages or less. Some of the stories are even shorter than that because as a journalist, I was a columnist, and I was used to writing 750 words for my column. And so I tried to continue that by telling stories in that same amount of time that I had as a professional journalist. So I do think that I had a muscle for doing that after 11 years of, if I spent 3 days with a subject, I still had to put it in 750 words. If I spent 1 hour, it was 750 words. So I learned how to pick details and tell a lot of information and convey a lot of beginning, middle, and end in a short space. So I really value that training as a journalist. I think the other thing that flash fiction helped me do, you talked about a novelist, how they often focus on one story, one character, and then take them through, a long journey. And for me, I had so many things I wanted to say about what it feels like to walk through this world as a woman. And then not all the women in the stories are African American. Only about maybe 40% of the stories are identifiably black. The women are old and young. The women are, there's some Indian, there's some Japanese, there's, the classes are different for the different women. So I felt like I had so many stories to tell that flash fiction let me tell 30 stories in the space that a novelist would tell one. I just had to get them out there.
Right.
So maybe I could settle down now and try to do a novel, but I just felt like I just had so many directions I wanted to come at this topic that flash fiction was my perfect vehicle for that.
And you do address many themes. What are some of the stories? Can you name a couple of stories that were really essential and critical for you to tell?
Wow. I mean, I think it would be hard for me to single out any because really I feel like every story gives a different slice, a different dimension. There are some that, for example, when I'm at readings, I get choked up. It's hard for me to get through them when I'm reading them.
Mm-hmm.
And one is Disappearing Girl. It's about a black mother who's picking her daughter up from private school. And
Yes.
and the little girl is the only black child in her class. And the child has gotten sullen and quiet and just very shut down, and the mother is piercing through that and kind of understanding the isolation that her daughter's feeling. And it's a little bit of a play on The Invisible Man. I'm thinking that's seminal. Not at all comparing my work to that, but that idea of how easy it is as African Americans to feel invisible. And then if you layer gender onto that, the invisibility is compounded, and it starts very early. And so that one's hard for me to read about because I do have a daughter, and I was raised in the middle class. I was an Air Force brat, and so there are many times where we were the only black family I knew, much less black child in the class. And so I did a lot of walking through the world, feeling like the only one. And so I wanted to capture that in that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that story really resonated for me. When I do publish my book, I have story that's similar of being the only black person in a Catholic school at
Mm.
5 years old. And every time I read it, I get choked up.
Yeah.
It's just a powerful memory.
Mhm.
You talk about some of the themes. I'm just going to uh, provide some examples of themes and just ask you to reflect on them. The How we compensate for the loss in our lives and its impact on the family and child.
Well, there's a lot of loss being woven through some of the stories. I think this is one reason I picked the ideal of mother, because that comes with it an assumption that your life is subjugated to at least one person, and that's the person you gave birth to. I do think that with mother also often comes wife, and that has its own, again, a different level of hierarchy within the home.
Mm-hmm.
And so women are expected to give up. I remember my mother, at the dinner table, giving my brother extra food, like off of her plate.
Yes.
And it's like, the boys have to eat, and it's okay if if I go a little bit hungry, because the kids need to eat. And of course, that's a survival mechanism. That's a wonderful, generous thing. But men don't have that same level of expectation, and also that comes with it is the expectation that we should be fine with that it's like a natural giving that doesn't ever come with it any resentment, which is so far from the truth. And so a number of the stories deal with women that are in that internal struggle about what they need and want versus what everybody else needs and want.
Right.
There's one story, Nocturne in particular, that is about a woman who really thought she was going to be a pianist, and she always loved music, and she competed around music, but at every phase of her life, that got pushed further back. And, she's at the end of her life, and she's not thinking, oh, I should have loved my children more, or I should have spent more time with my family. She's
Mm-hmm.
thinking, I should have loved myself more, that I'm sorry I don't have more time for my music. And that's something that I think is repeated in a number of the stories, that how women lose themselves.
Right. I put that under the theme of the need that we have for love, desire, and passion in our lives.
Hmm. And the world would make women believe that a good, healthy, happy family and a wonderful husband satisfies that need for passion in their lives. That was not my personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Right. But
um,
it's a recurring experience in fiction, in women's stories particularly.
yes,
It's recurring.
yes, especially when you look at romance. The whole romance genre, is that fulfillment around relationship with others as opposed to relationship to self.
Right.
Um, and just because we successfully attain those relationships and maintain with others, there's still often for many women a loss, profound grief of loss of self.
Right. You also bring in the history, the civil rights movement.
Hmm.
I can see that music is very important to you in your life.
Hmm.
I could hear the music in some of the stories,
Yeah.
the music from the 50s, from the 60s.
Hmm. Well, I'm 57, so that pretty much nails it. That's the music of my childhood. I also spent much of my adult life in Detroit, where Motown just hasn't gone away.
Right.
So it's been reinforced. Even my millennial kids are very steeped in Motown music.
Right, that's
Um,
what they're surrounded with.
yeah. But yeah, music and civil rights, I mean, that's kind of a commentary on time passing and how much has or hasn't changed. Um, and and what remains for, again, Not all the characters are African American, but you look at the African American characters in the stories, and we see that a lot hasn't changed around race or gender.
Right.
And so that the women, there's a story, it's called Home for the Holidays, about a black couple driving from Detroit to Maryland.
That's the one I was thinking about. Yes.
Yeah, and on the way they're they're tailgated by a truck that's kind of trying to run them off the road, and they realize quickly these are white racists who are attacking them because their license plate signifies that they're from Detroit, and so is what attracts this truck to this car. And they have two babies in the back seat. It's the middle of the night. There's no one else there. And that story is, that's really driving while black, guys. That's what that feels like.
That's right.
The safety, and it's never been safe for black families on the road. It's not a new thing, and it's not only about, and I'm again not at all taking away from the focus that we've had about police stops and the danger of that, but it's danger from the other drivers on the road, the civilians who have harassed black motorists.
Right.
It's
It's amazing how these stories just continue. As you said, they recur over time. I always think of writers in conversation with other writers. Who are the people who've influenced you? Who are you in conversation with as a writer?
Oh gosh, that is such a good question. I read so much, and I read so many things. Camille Dungy has a book out now that I am blanking on the name of. It's so great. But she's a poet turned essayist who is writing about traveling as a black woman with her daughter and trying to keep her professional life alive while weaving in motherhood and raising a girl. And I was just profoundly moved by her collection. Just really, really wonderful work. I was on the board of Cave Canem, which is a residency for black poets, and was really, I am not really a poet. I've had some published, but I don't see myself as an accomplished poet. But breathing the air of poets has been tremendously important to me. And there's just so many black poets out there now that are just so amazing and saying incredible things. In reading that, some of my stories, I think you can hear the poetry and the influence of that in my work. So poetry really does influence my work a lot.
You were on the board of Cave Canem, which leads me to another question. As you know, the Center for Black Literature produced the National Black Writers Conference. There are some who will say we don't really need a conference. We also have done workshops in the past. What are your thoughts on the need to host National Black Writers Conferences and writers residencies?
Who says that? Where are they? Who says that? That is like, no. I mean, I do think that we are, I'm not sure if it's been named yet, but we are entering a golden age of black writing. When you look at like the Pulitzers, the book awards, black writers are just hands down, showing up and winning these awards in ways that just have really blown me away. So that the mainstream, no, that's not mainstream. That's the elite are seeing or validating the craft and skill and storytelling of black writers now. I think what hasn't happened as much is the market, that from MFA programs to publishers to agents, there's a constant winnowing out of the black voice, or trying to reshape the black voice, or trying to pigeonhole the black voice, or not valuing it in any way. So many people that I know feel damaged from their MFA programs, that people didn't understand, what they were writing. They questioned the plots and the characters. When we write our truth, it's not their truth, and so we're grilled about it. So having Black writers conferences, Black writing residencies is tremendously important to the growth of the Black, the voices of people of color. Because not only Black, we're seeing now Asian writers and writers of color banding together. We have to create these safe places where we can grow so that our writing isn't killed at its inception, that there's time for it to develop and flourish and be validated, on the way to winning a Pulitzer or a National Book Award.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. As we come to a close, Desiree, we've been talking with Desiree Cooper, the author of Know the Mother. What message do you have for writers, for our students? We have a program where students can concentrate on either creative writing, professional writing, or cross-cultural literature. So what is your message to our students, to our writers, and to the general public about writing?
Well, specifically to developing writers, I think it's so important to get a community around you. This is what we just talked about. This is what you guys provide to writers, that isn't just supportive but also instructive. I mean, often, especially new writers, I always say it's like playing tennis against the wall, like you're really good at beating yourself. But you got to get somebody that can hit the ball back, right?
Right.
So you have to be around people that are going to elevate your game, really respect your intent and your direction and your own aesthetic, but help you grow it. So you can't do that by yourself, and you've got to be careful about what environment you take your writing into. So find supportive, instructive places to grow as a writer, and just keep doing it. You do well what you do much, is what my mother always says. So you got to just keep writing, and one day it'll get to that place where you want it to be.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's really inspirational, and it's a story I'm going to make sure that our English majors hear, particularly those who are going into writing. That's our largest concentration, the people who want to be creative writers, and the many paths that you can take. So our listening audience, please go out and purchase Know the Mother, Stories by Desiree Cooper. I want to thank my engineer, Fritz Richardson. And remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. As we go off, you will be hearing Gary Bartz. Thank you again, Desiree.
Thank you.
All right.
Next song was inspired by a